Testing, testing. Good evening. My name is Alfred Tatum. I'm the Dean of the College of Education here at UIC, and I just wanted to take this opportunity to welcome you on behalf of our Chancellor and Provost for this important series of conversations across 3 universities. It's rare that I sit near my emails waiting for a response, but when I sent out the invitation to Dr. Eve Tuck, I did just that. And she gifted me with a response based on the recommendations of my colleagues here at UIC. And I also want to take a quick moment to thank you for gifting our graduate students with your words today. That was going above and beyond, knowing that you would have to speak with this wonderful group with us this evening. So my charge at this point is really to introduce Dr. Naila Nasir, who will provide more information about our series. Dr. Nasir is the 6th president of the Spencer Foundation. She was a faculty member at the University of California, Berkeley from 2008 to 2017, where she served as Vice Chancellor for Equity and Inclusion at UC Berkeley from November 2015. Nasir earned her PhD in Education Psychology at UCLA. I almost claimed just one of her own. Would have to ask you for some development funds if I do that. From UCLA, and was a member of the faculty of the School of Education at Stanford University from 2000 to 2008. Her work focuses on issues of race, culture, learning, and identity. She is the author of Racialized Identities, Race and Achievement for African American Youth, and has published numerous scholarly articles. Nasir is a member of the National Academy of Education and a fellow of the American Education Research Association. In 2016, she was the recipient of the AERA Division G Mentoring Award. The Spencer Foundation was established in 1972 through the gift of Lyle Spencer and supports research about education. The foundation is committed to supporting high-quality investigation of education through its research programs and to strengthen and renewing the educational research community through its fellowship and training programs and related activities. At this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Naila Nasir.
Good afternoon. I couldn't be more pleased to welcome you all to the second talk of the Chicago Education Speaker Series. It's so great to see so many friends and colleagues and folks in the room. This series consists of 3 talks a year, and it's a collaboration between the Spencer Foundation, University of Illinois Chicago, University of Chicago, and Northwestern. Really grateful to Al Tatum, David Figlio, and Steve Rodenbush, who've been kind of a dream team in pulling all of this together. Our goal with this series is to support deeper relationships between education scholars from all of the higher education institutions across Chicago, and we have representation from all of those institutions today. So in that spirit, at some point this evening, meet somebody from another institution, say hello. We have a reception following the talk with, I'm sure, wonderful food and drink, give you the opportunity. Each of the 3 talks this year takes up a different topic in relation to the broader theme of understanding the complex ecology of students' lives and communities beyond school. Our goal was to reflect on topics particularly germane to the Chicago context and that took seriously the nuances and complexities of students' lives outside of schools and the implications of those contexts for thinking about education. Each talk is hosted at a different institution. The first was Professor Robert Vargas, who we hosted in February at Northwestern. I unfortunately had the flu and had to miss it, so excited to be up and about and here today. The next talk will be May 2nd when Professor James Rosenbaum will be hosted by U of C and will be speaking on community college and school-to-work transitions in the face of a changing economy. But tonight, we have a very special speaker, Professor Eve Tuck, who will be speaking on a topic of tremendous importance to us as a research community and one which is near and dear to my own heart. The title of her talk today is This Thing On? Researching with Youth and Communities. And the width in her title is really key, and I'll say more about that in a moment. But let me first share a little more about Professor Tuck. Professor Tuck is an associate professor of critical race and Indigenous studies at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. She is Unanga and an enrolled member of the Alouette community of St. Paul Island, Alaska. Her research centers on urban education and Indigenous studies. More specifically, she focuses on how Indigenous social thought can be engaged to create fairer and more just social policy, more meaningful social movements, and robust approaches to decolonization. She is extremely productive as a scholar and has written numerous books and articles, including Urban Youth and School Pushout, which is about how accountability policies tacitly and explicitly push out underperforming students from the system, and Place in Research, which outlines an approach she, along with her colleague Marcia McKenzie, call critical place inquiry, which both furthers empirical knowledge and ethically imagines new possibilities for collaboration and action between researchers and communities. She is also a Ford Foundation Fellow and a WT Grant Scholar. I first heard of her work when my students at Berkeley discovered her 2009 Harvard Ed Review article, Suspending Damage, A Letter to Communities. And for those of you in the room who are maybe a little older like me, this piece for me is akin to our generation's relationship with Lisa Delpit's Other People's Children, right? With that piece, Professor Tuck started a conversation that we were not really having in the academy in the way she was bringing it around the core of the relationship between the researcher and the research, calling out the deficit frames that position communities in relation to research in ways that further marginalize them. In this piece, she writes, quote, "This is an open letter addressed to educational researchers and practitioners concerned with fostering and maintaining ethical relationships with disenfranchised and dispossessed communities and all of those troubled by the possible hidden costs of a research strategy that frames entire communities as depleted." These are powerful words, and they beg the question, what does research look like when it engages communities with respect? So looking forward to hearing her thoughts on that topic today. Our format today will be that Professor Tuck will speak for about 40 minutes. Then we will hear comments from our respondent, Professor Nicole Pinkard. So I'll introduce Professor Pinkard now, just to keep the flow smooth later. Professor Pinkard is an associate professor of learning sciences. You're going to give him a wave, Nicole? At Northwestern University. Her research focuses on the design and use of pedagogical-based social networks, ecological models of learning, and computational making learning environments for underrepresented groups. She's the founder of multiple innovative community learning spaces, including the Digital Youth Network and U-Media. Her research has always placed communities at the center, and she's been working at Northwestern to foster community-university collaborations through CESP's Office of STEM Education Partnerships. On a personal note, I have known Professor Pinkard since we were both doc students following Professor Carol Lee around at AERA every year. She is not only a top scholar who asks deep and probing questions, she is a powerful woman who has incredible integrity and who builds amazing learning ecologies for young people. So I look forward to hearing your comments. And just in closing, I think we're in a potential renaissance moment around research methods in our field and about how we conduct rigorous, high-quality research in a way that honors and holds community knowledge from a place of respect. Professor Tuck and Professor Pinkard are certainly at the center of this work, and I'm personally really excited about this moment and about thinking about research, not just as knowledge building, but about research as a human endeavor that also pushes us to think about ethics and the heart of what we do and how we do it. So with no further ado, I welcome Professor Tuck to the stage.
It's good to be with you. Eve Tuck Esta Cooking. And I would like to thank Dr. Nasir and Dr. Tatum for the invitation. Thank you, Dr. Pinkard, for reading my paper yesterday in order to make comments on it today. And thank you also to Doris, who has been so persistent in emailing me in order to make arrangements for today. I'd like to begin by talking about some of the work that Megan Bang and her colleagues have done And I'm going to do an extended reading from one of their pieces that talks about Chicago as Indigenous land. They write, "Muskrat is an earth diver. He finds home in shadowy wetlands, relational dynamisms between land and water, amongst the plant medicines that grow here. Our elders know the story of why this is. Wetlands are places of continual birth, death, and rebirth. Scientists have said that wetlands are on the front lines of globalization and climate change. They name wetlands as critical environmental niches, which are correlated with significant human survival and development. Ironically, in more recent human history, the depraved view of land as material, or as only material, has led to their filling or drainage without regard by nation-states across the earth. After annihilation, manipulation, and removal of indigenous peoples from particular lands, major cities were founded and expanded by filling wetlands. For example, Chicago, formerly known as Chicawa, among other names of this land. The filling in of wetlands, their intended erasure, can be viewed as perhaps a climatic move of settler colonialism, the attempted replacement of original lands with new land structures. Chicago is a wetland that becomes part prairie and part oak savanna. It's hard to see with the layers of colonial fill, but actually it's hiding in plain sight. The wetlands are re-becoming themselves, despite the centuries of attempted erasure, remaking, and geographical violence of the emergence of land and water in dynamic relationships, and the life it supports emerges. Rebirthing of land is not new, if we remember, as we find our way in becoming. Indigenous people continue to live in the wetlands of Chicago and Chicawa. Generations of indigenous nations have been in relations, ancestral, medicinal, migrational, and economic, with these wetlands. An elder in the Chicago Native community took Bang and her colleagues for a walk through the alleys of Chicago and pointed out our plant relatives, literally sema, tobacco, and not the genetically altered form bred for colonial usage, grows in the cracks of pavement here in Chicago. And it grows in contested lands, normatively known as forest preserves. Sema, sprinkled throughout the city, in emergent, unforeseen places, because land is always re-becoming itself. When I was in my early 20s and living in New York City, after graduating from university and before going to graduate school, I worked as a community educator with community organizations and youth organizations. I worked for a sustained time for Youth Ministries for Peace and Justice, a youth-led community organization in the Morrison Soundview neighborhood of the South Bronx. This organization, founded by community leader Alexi Torres Fleming, and into its second decade during my time working there as first a spoken word teacher and then as co-director for its Education for Liberation program, was and continues to be one of my most influential teachers. I worked alongside youth and community leaders who taught me to be critical of youth success narratives which required young people to leave their home community in order to make it. This organization taught me not to be satisfied with tokenistic understandings of youth leadership. Youth were never superficial add-ons to the work that adults did. Instead, the entire program worked to bring theory and experiences to youth, to give them spaces to try on ideas, bring theory and to try on ideas, to design campaigns and to organize. During the years that I spent as a community educator in this organization, youth were organizing campaigns against environmental racism and police brutality. This was in a neighborhood that was crisscrossed by highways used primarily by tractor-trailer trucks, a neighborhood that was along the Bronx River but could not access the river due to fences and netting, but also the conditions of the river itself. It was in this context that I learned about the connections between environmental racism and state violence. This was in the weeks and months and years after Amadou Diallo, a much-loved Black man from Guinea, was shot 19 times by 41 bullets just outside of his apartment by 4 NYPD officers. This is where I developed a critique of policing as state violence and ultimately came to understand abolition as a theory of change. The time between the police killing of Amadou Diallo in February 4th, 1999, and September 10th, 2001, was an important time for organizing against police brutality, killings of unarmed people by police, and police policy and tactics in New York City and across the United States. The officers, Sean Carroll, Kenneth Boss, Edward McMillan, and Richard Murphy, were acquitted of second-degree murder, and in February 2000, much to the outrage of Diallo's family, people in his community, and hundreds of thousands of people organizing and otherwise following this trial. Numerous scholars have detailed the impacts and the attacks of the attacks in New York City and Washington, D.C. on September 11th, 2001, for Arab communities, for Muslim communities, and more broadly, and for people of color with regard to increased police and public surveillance, the suspension of civil rights, limits on traveling freely, and other infringements on rights to expression, critique, and protest. For those of us working at that time to critique policing and surveillance tactics by the state, 9/11 also had a dramatic chilling effect on our ability to demand justice in these matters. Because police served as first responders in the attacks, there was much public display of support for police officers and policing. This taught me a great deal about narratives employed by the state to quash critique, especially at a time in which cities like New York City and others were militarizing their police departments and sending police personnel to be trained in Israel and other nation states with heavily armed borders. These were the years in which I participated in countless protests and direct actions, at rallies to decommission an abandoned manufacturing plant, on the streets of Manhattan protesting the Bush administration's unfounded decision to make war in Afghanistan and Iraq, on the steps of the Tweed building, and on marches to One Police Plaza. I always gave my attention to the signs and messages that people carried in protest. Many signs rightly called attention to the harm that a corporation, an institution, or the state are causing. Many signs documented the damage that racism and neglect, but also imperialism and colonialism cause in communities. Signs often said things like, "I'm worried for my children," or "Your pollution is killing us," and conveyed concerns about distributions of toxicity, disease, and death. Reading all of these signs together often made me wonder about what we were saying about ourselves in terms of abilities to protect ourselves and our children, to dream of healthy futures, or to appeal to corporations or the state for moral justice. One sign that Youth Ministries for Peace and Justice used at community hearings and other demonstrations, a sign that taught me then and the memory of which continues to teach me now, said, "We live here, we're experts too." This shift between holding signs, and narratives about damage done by colonialism, violence, polluting, and the calling attention to the expertise of everyday people about their communities and the institutions that they inhabit would become one of the most important shifts in my intellectual life. This distinction between calling attention to damage and calling attention to lived experience would become one of the defining features of my work. I am Unanga from St. Paul Island, Alaska, on my mom's side, and white from rural Pennsylvania on my dad's side. I grew up in rural Pennsylvania near both my dad's parents and my mom's parents, who moved just under a mile away from our house that was surrounded by cornfields, wooden train tracks, cow pastures, and not very much else. Ever since I was 8 years old, I knew that I wanted to live in New York City. When the time came to apply to universities, I applied to one, Eugene Lang College of the New School for Social Research in Manhattan. While there, I studied writing and education, although I didn't want to become a teacher because my mom had been a teacher, and I saw how she worked long hours into the night on lesson planning, preparing learning materials, and classroom activities. I was also very afraid of her classroom pets, which all died in very scary ways. In my final year of my bachelor's degree, I had a professor named Gregory Tewksbury who told me about a new PhD program in urban education that was being started at the Graduate Center, the City University of New York. Not knowing very much about graduate school or how graduate school is pretty much vocational training school for professors, I applied to the program. I had applied to one program for my undergrad, and I applied to one program for my PhD. And if I didn't get in, I wasn't going to go. I didn't know very much. See, you would have been missing all of this. I didn't know very much about how universities work. I was waitlisted for the urban education program, and the program administrators encouraged me to take a couple of courses to see if it was really a good fit for me. The very first class in which I enrolled was Professor Stanley Aronowitz's course called The Structures of Social Knowledge. The first meeting of the class was on the evening that turned out to be 9/11, 2001. Classes, the building, the whole city was closed that night. But the course began the following week. It was only in my second course, a mandatory course on research in the discipline of education, that I even began to understand that research is something that one learns to do in graduate school. I didn't know at the time that research is such a key aspect and activity of academe. I was in total crisis. My Unanga grandmother was sending me letters about how she was telling all of her girlfriends that I was going to be a doctor, and I was sitting in classes in which I was and continue to be the only person from my community to have a PhD. And I was sitting in classes in which empirical research was being taught as a benign set of activities. I had grown up with stories of researchers coming into Unangan homes on St. Paul Island and into other Alaska Native communities. These were stories of deception, abuse, and disrespect. These were stories of university researchers knowingly or unknowingly colluding with the officials of either the Department of the Interior or Fish and Wildlife that were assigned to monitor and control our people until our independence in 1984. In these anthropological and biomedical studies, consent was either not requested or consent was extracted. One community elder told me a story about how in one study, a researcher would periodically come to the door with the white village supervisor, a white person appointed by the federal government to monitor our people, to take a blood sample from her and her children, sometimes by force, in exchange for $1. This was in the 1960s. These were the associations that my community has with research. And I did not want to have anything to do with such exploitative, coercive, and colonial practices. I was outraged and disgusted by the history of research that had happened to our community. I was never going to promote those practices. My former professor, Gregory Tewksbury, who would also do his PhD in the urban education program, had arranged for me to meet Dr. Michelle Fine, a brilliant participatory scholar. I had met with Michelle once or twice before this crisis, and sometime during this research course, I went to her office to do that thing where you say thank you, but I don't think that this is for me, and that I would not be doing the program after all. It was in that conversation with Michelle, who not only encouraged me not to quit, but to stay and stay loudly, that I came to know more about Michelle's powerful interventions into participatory action research, the possibilities for community agency in research, and the kinds of ethical and epistemological challenges that participatory feminist researchers were making into the colonial enterprise of knowledge production in the academy. That is when I became her student. Michelle Fine writes that participatory action researchers ground our work in the recognition that expertise and knowledge are widely distributed. PAR further assumes that those who have been most systematically excluded, oppressed, or denied carry specifically revealing wisdom about the history, structure, consequences, and the fracture points in unjust social arrangements. PAR embodies a democratic commitment to break the monopoly on who holds knowledge and for whom social science research should be undertaken. We live here, we're experts too. I tell this story in order to say that this experience of crisis, though it was a catalyst for me to truly become a student of Michelle Fine, and though it has been a way for me to understand my own work in relationship to the academy, this crisis has never been resolved. I exist in the academy with a sense of great strain and tension, which I experience as a deep and sustained ambivalence about the academy and its future. This ambivalence is present in nearly all of my academic publications, and it helps me to challenge the arrogance of ideas like universality, generalizability, or even fully ever knowing something in writing and in teaching. In writing that I did with Black feminist scholar Monique Gashard, who also was a student of Michelle Fine, Monique and I emphasized the importance of humility and dignity in participatory action research. Humility requires researchers to abdicate the throne of knowing and of moral superiority, to understand that there are unforeseen risks, problems with their chosen methodology, research questions, modes of informed consent, among others, which community partners are more knowledgeable about. Humility is an extension of reflexivity, requiring researchers to be more reflexive and more transparent about our standpoints, but also the limits of our theories and analytical strategies. Ethical, decolonial, participatory action research endeavors to preserve dignity. It does not commodify or appropriate. Instead, it builds on the existing strengths and talents of community collaborators while assisting in the cultivation of new capacities and skills. Ethical, decolonial, participatory action research honors the self-defining identities of the people who have been colonized and oppressed, and those are Linda Tuhiwai-Smith's words, but also the private spaces, personal stories, and community knowledge to which we are privileged to gain access, document, and bear witness. Collectives formed by researchers, participants, and community members are key, perhaps rare sites of self-determination in which members speak what is otherwise silenced, make transparent that which is otherwise concealed, and make meaningful that which is otherwise forgotten or devalued. There is dignity in the work of creating a space for ourselves, the kind of space that has been otherwise systematically denied to us. An additional aspect of dignity within decolonial PAR work is the differentiation between the public and the sacred. Research collectives can decide which elements of their work to open source, meaning the methodology, methods, theory, data, and analyses can be shared and potentially used by others. Materials determined to be sacred can be shared only with community members, perhaps in community newsletters or community forums. They might never be talked about, they might be talked about but never written down. But they might never leave the research collective. Some examples of private or sacred materials that might be never be made public are tribal stories, stories of humiliation that re-humiliate when they're told, and stories that can serve as examples that reify stereotypes. In part, to consider the public and the sacred is to consider the idea that the academy does not need to know everything, or even most things, uncovered in a participatory action research project. There are some stories that the academy has not proved itself worthy to know. One thing that I have continued to learn from Monique Gachard's work over the past decade is the disavowal of the academy as the sole or even as among the most important sites for creating social change. Monique's work has attended to the power of community knowledge and knowing, of ethical frameworks crafted with historical, place-based specificity, and the intergenerational transfer of organizing wisdom that makes communities smart and courageous. This is, of course, among the contributions of many scholars who have influenced my work, including Michelle Fine, Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, Lee Patel, Kay Wayne Yang, Patricia Kruger-Henney, Jessica Ruggles, and many others. But Monique's work, in particular, has time and time again attended to the theorizing that people do as they move in and out of institutions, about those institutions and the structures of the societies that made them. We live here, we're experts too. One of my first publications, titled Suspending Damage, A Letter to Communities, was concerned with the damage narratives that are used in social science and in community organizing to try to compel social change. I had been working with theories of desire throughout graduate school, especially influenced by post-structural theorists, even though I had to later break up with Deleuze. But also reading work by Indigenous scholars like Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, Vine Deloria Jr., Greg Kahiti, Oscar Coagli, Sandy Grande, and Beatrice Medicine, who helped me to develop an understanding of Indigenous sovereignty and ways of knowing. I was also reading work by scholars like Avery Gordon, Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, Patricia Williams, Pauline Lipman, Jean Anyon, and William E. Cross to understand complexity, complex personhood, and storytelling. I conceived of this letter of this article as a letter in the tradition of Sherry Moraga, Gloria Anzaldúa, and Zora Neale Hurston, whose public letters were addressed to a dear audience, but in which some of the messages of the letter were always intended to those voyeurs, the lurkers, who were also reading the letter. Gloria Anzaldúa's Speaking in Tongues, a letter to Third World women writers, is instructive to her dear audience, while raining a scalding critique of the voyeurs to the discussion. She tells Third World women to write about the unmentionables, never minding the outraged gasp of the censors or the audience. Her last words in the letter: "Don't fake it. Try to sell it for a hand clap or your name in print. Love, Gloria." I'm going to share some of the parts of my own letter now. So please think of this as a letter from me to you. I write this letter to people who have troubled relations with research and researchers. The trouble comes from the historical exploitation and mistreatment of lives and material. These characterizations frame our communities as sites of disinvestment and dispossession. Our communities become spaces in which under-resourced health and economic infrastructures are endemic. They become spaces saturated in the fantasies of outsiders. I write to you now because I believe that our communities can exercise decision-making power in these issues. Further, because so many outsiders benefit from depicting communities as damaged, it will have to be these same communities that hold researchers accountable from the frameworks and the attitudes that they employ. It is too tempting for these poor researchers to proceed as usual. For many of us, the research on our communities has historically been damage-centered, intent on portraying our neighborhoods and Indigenous communities as defeated and broken. Stories of teeth counting, rib counting, head measuring, blood drawn, bones dug up, medical treatment withheld, erroneous or fabricated ethnography, unsanctioned camera lenses, out-and-out lies, empty promises, cover-ups, betrayals. These are all the stories of our kitchen tables. Though this research has done much harm, in this letter I'm writing about research which seeks to document pain or loss in an individual, a community, or a tribe. Though connected to deficit models, frameworks that emphasize what a particular student, family, or community is lacking to explain underachievement or failure, damage-centered research is distinct in being more socially and historically situated. It looks to historical, I just almost started talking about white liberalism, but let me bring it back in. It looks to historical exploitation, domination, and colonization to explain contemporary brokenness, such as poverty, poor health, and low literacy. Common sense tells us that this is a good thing, but the danger in damage-centered research is that it is a pathologizing approach in which the oppression comes to singularly define a community. Some scholars have built their careers around producing damaged narratives of oppressed peoples. Indigenous communities, poor communities, Black communities, communities of color, and otherwise disenfranchised people tolerate this kind of data gathering because there is an implicit and sometimes explicit assurance that stories of damage pay off in material, sovereign, and political wins. Many communities engage, allow, and participate in damage-centered research and the construction of damage narratives as a strategy for correcting oppression. But I think that the theory of change itself is unreliable and is ineffective. It is a powerful idea to think of all of us as litigators, putting the world on trial, but it doesn't actually work. Do the material and political wins ever come through? And most importantly, are those wins worth the long-term costs of thinking of ourselves as damaged? I want to recognize that there is a need for research that exposes state violence, the uninhabitable and inhumane conditions in which the state forces people to live. One alternative to damage-centered research is to craft our research to capture desire instead of damage. I think that a desire-based framework can be an antidote to damage-centered research. Desire-based research frameworks are concerned with understanding complexity, contradiction, and the self-determination of lived lives. Desire-based frameworks defy the lure to serve as what Craig Gingrich Philbrook calls advertisements for power, by documenting not only the painful elements of social realities, but also the wisdom and hope. Such an axiology is intent on depathologizing the experiences of dispossessed peoples, so that people are seen as much more than broken and conquered. This is to say that even when communities are broken and conquered, they are so much more than that. So much more that this incomplete story is an act of aggression. Desire resists the all too easy, one-dimensional narratives of damage in order to expose ongoing structural inequity. Desire-based research frameworks can yield analyses that upend commonly held assumptions of responsibility, cohesiveness, ignorance, and paralysis within dispossessed and disenfranchised communities. Desire, yes, accounts for the loss and the despair, but also the hope, the visioning, the wisdom of lived lives and communities. Desire is involved in the not yet, and at times, the not anymore. This letter, published a short time after I finished my PhD, has been one of those works that continues to bring amazing people into my life. As scary as publishing can be, especially because there is so much that I wish that I could say in a different way now, one of the satisfying aspects of this risky behavior is that it has allowed me to meet people who are writing and thinking about exactly what I want to write and think about. One of the long-standing pieces of advice for new academics is to try to play it safe until tenure, to wait until after tenure to publish radical work. This is advice that does not serve Black, Indigenous, and people of color scholars. Maybe it works for white scholars, but as Audre Lorde has observed, your silence will not protect you. In fact, publishing that loud work, that critical work, that can't be ignored work, is precisely what makes it hard for universities to deny tenure to BIPOC scholars. They might try it, but they will get a fight. Even more importantly, our publications are what works like a nightclub spotlight dragging across the sky. They bring people to the club, ready to be present for what you are spinning. Making research that attends to desire, to complex personhood, has brought remarkable students into my life. Our work in the academy is just different. It has a different goal than that work that tries to document damage. This work recognizes that settler societies are going to see us as damaged anyway. Instead, I am here for research that understands, as Amy Meredith Cox puts it, that all social actors across status positions, race, genders, and ages determine the best course of action to take, as well as how and where to invest their labor and time, depending on their relationship to their environment. Actions that may be helpful in terms of surviving, protecting one's body or reputation, or permitting greater access and mobility in one space may very well be detrimental in another. If individual motivations are understood in this way as perspectives that can inform acts that are inflected with agency and subjugation, we can dismantle what Leith Mullings calls the essentialized notions of culture that view culture as an immutable set of negative traits passed down from generation to generation as explanations for inequality. Documenting damage is about demonstrating worthiness to be recognized as human within a framing of humanity that requires the oppression of others. In this construction of power and humanity, power is scarce. There are limited amounts of it, and it's only evident when it's being wielded above others. This is what I mean when I say that documenting damage relies on colonial understandings of power and change. Power is concentrated, scarce, and it's always external to us. I also ask that we think fully about theories of change that rely on raising awareness or raising visibility. As Saidiya Hartman notes, at issue here is the precariousness of empathy and the uncertain line between witness and spectator. This theory of change, of raising awareness, assumes that people are unaware of an injustice or an issue or illness or social calamity, and that in making them more aware, we ready them to take appropriate action. This is an interesting thing to argue in an education series, right? But raising awareness is a theory of pre-change. It assumes that people will generally do the right thing with the right information. It anticipates that the reason for inaction thus far is missing information or lack of depth of understanding of the significance of need, where we know that a lot of times that inaction is because people are benefiting from that inaction. Raising awareness is a cousin theory of change to documenting damage. Both often rely on circulating narratives and tropes of the mutilated body, the broken spirit, the flooded neighborhood. Images of destruction compete for dollars on Facebook to wrench the most sympathy for donations, for charity, for compassion, for mattering. There isn't a relationship between the evocativeness of the photograph and the amount of the donation that goes to those in need. There isn't a relationship between the story of loss and the supplies that come. Again, Saidiya Hartman's work is crucial for understanding the limits of empathy and the ways that empathy actually turns quite quickly into feelings for oneself. Hartman notes, talking about the aftermath of chattel slavery, if this pain has been largely unspoken and unrecognized, it is due to the sheer denial of Black sentience rather than the inexpressibility of pain. So much of what we do to compel change relies on raising awareness. But what if we, as communities, as collectives, were to disbelieve awareness as change? What if we, as Indigenous peoples, as people of color, as disenfranchised people, believe that our own awareness, our own knowing, is enough to make change? What if we did not wait for others to also know, but are inspired by our own knowing? What if we hold true that we are the ones who need to know, and not others? What if we believe that we are the ones who can make the change, and that others are not more powerful than us to make change? These are the radical questions that throb at what gets taken for granted as the work of social justice, of organizing, and of public scholarship. These two ideas, desire and theories of change, are among the most abiding in my work and in my work with the next generations of scholars. When I was in graduate school, one of the main paradigmatic decisions that was presented to me as someone beginning to design new research was whether that work would be qualitative or quantitative. For some students in some graduate programs, perhaps some of you in this room, this is still your red pill or blue pill choice. Qualitative or quantitative. And then, like, the purple mixed methods, purple pill approach is one that tries to straddle this choice to show that they need not be mutually exclusive and indeed could be meaningfully engaged to inform one another. And this is, there's a number of scholars who are associated with the Public Science Project in New York City who have elegantly demonstrated this over many years. The choice between qualitative and quantitative that was so prominent in my graduate school years is preceded by another decision, one that scholars in the generation before mine tangled with, which was, are positivist or post-positivist. This, too, may be the contemporary red pill or blue pill for people in this room. It haunts. I'm not saying that this is temporarily bound in the past. I am trying to say that I was taught by people who were not caught up in that decision. They were post-positivist. Insofar as what positivism was positive about was settler colonialism and anti-Blackness, I would say that the Indigenous scholars and Black feminist scholars that I have read and learned from are anti-positivist. So here we go. I believe, and this is what I'm trying to bring to you today, I believe that the most compelling decision in this moment of doing academic research is, do you do research on people or with people? Do you do research on people or with people? On people or with people? I published Suspending Damage in 2009, but I wrote most of it throughout 2007 and 2008. This is often how publishing goes. I wrote that piece before reading work by Saidiya Hartman on Scenes of Subjection, though that book was published in 1997. Before I read Leith Mulling's 2000 book, On Our Terms, and before I read Audra Simpson's 2007 article on ethnographic refusal. In my teaching on ideas and desire and complex personhood, on the question of on people or with people, works by Hartman, Mullings, and Simpson are foundational. These works push back against the colonial thirsts of the academy to know everything, to say everything, to give everyone access to everything. Several years ago, I simultaneously became the co-program chair with Ruben Gastambide Fernandez and then with Kei Wayne Yang for Division B, which is the Division for Curriculum Studies of the American Educational Research Association, at the same time that I became the co-editor with Kei Wayne Yang of the Critical Ethnic Studies Journal. I do not at all recommend doing these roles simultaneously to anybody except for Kei Wayne Yang, who did them both with me at the same time. I only recommend that to him. But one of the important ideas that we wanted to center in both of these domains is the citational practice that we are inviting. This is not at all to say that I have always been great in my own citational practice. Actually, there are times that I have struggled to name and remember and recognize and be in relation to the texts and people that inform my ideas. Attending to citational practices is an example of what Lisa Lowe, following Edward Said, calls a contrapuntal reading, in which we attend to, I wonder if I have this on a slide. I do, okay. Not to a project of merely telling history differently, but one of returning to the past its gaps, uncertainties, impasses, and elisions. It is tracing those moments of eclipse when obscure, unknown, or unperceived elements are lost. Those significant moments in which transformations have begun to take place, but have not yet been inserted into historical time. This is a way I think that we can think about citational practices, that we are rewriting the past in order to rewrite our futures. So the citational practice challenge was a challenge for all of us, and the language of it was to invite people to reflect on the way that you approach referencing the work of others in your own writing, presenting, and thinking. Whose work do you build on to make arguments, to describe the field and the problems that you engage in your work? Who are you citing, and why do you cite them and not others? Consider what you might want to change in your academic citation practices. Who do you choose to link and recirculate in your work? Who gets erased? Who should you stop citing? Sarah Ahmed describes citation practices as a rather successful reproduction technology, a way of reproducing the world around certain bodies. Citation structures form disciplines, Ahmed tells us. Ahmed says that the reproduction of a discipline can be the reproduction of these techniques of selection, ways of making certain bodies and thematics core to the discipline and others not even part. Indeed, our practices of citation make and remake our fields, making some forms of knowledge peripheral. We often cite those who are more famous, even if their contributions appropriate subaltern ways of knowing. We often cite those who frame problems in ways that speak against us. Over time, our citational practices become repetitive. We cite the same people that we cited as newcomers to a conversation, but that doesn't make sense. Our practices sometimes persist without consideration of the politics of linking projects to the same tired reference lists. So at first, with the Citation Practices Challenge, we thought that we would have like an email-based listserv. I think we thought we were Gwyneth Paltrow, but we thought we were gonna like share tips and meditations and like recipes. But actually, it turned into this really beautiful Tumblr account, and it's at citationpractices.tumblr.com. And that Tumblr account was first hosted by Sam Spady and Fiona Shuck, who are both amazing doctoral students in the Social Justice Education Department at UIC. And now it's entirely curated by Fiona Shuck. And Fiona's work on the Citation Practices Challenge Tumblr is an example of the pausing reading practice that Lee Patel describes in her 2016 book, Decolonizing Education Research. Fiona's pausing involves a careful read of recent news articles, events, reviews, and artistic installations, and a consideration of how they open up new and old practices of citation, of indicating the genealogies of knowing and telling. Attending to citational practices isn't to try to introduce another kind of perfectionism or performativity to our work, but rather a humility, a nerdy gratitude for the ways that ideas flow and move from one reader to another, to what we could have known if time were organized in a different way, to the glimpses of our future relations. To say, I didn't read that then, but I have read it now, and I'm grateful for it, is to be in better relation than the arrogance of ignoring a person's work because they said something similar at the same time as you, or said something different at a different time than you. Over the past number of years, in my collaborations with Kay Wayne Yang, we have looked closely at terms, wondering about what others mean by them, what we mean by them, and the work those terms can and cannot do. We did this with the word resistance in 2014, with identity throughout 2017, and we have done this at different times with the word justice. So we are trying very hard not to make this our thing, and that we take a word that means a great deal to conversations in the field of education that have otherwise been shut down, and then write into it so heavily that the term dematerializes. We're not trying to like remove words. Oh, I forgot that we also did that to the word decolonization. So this is not what we are trying to do in our most recent book, which is called Toward What Justice, which is published just last month by Routledge. So in that edited volume, we don't want to turn justice into a fugitive subject which cannot be known or fully described. Justice is not mysterious. There are social justice projects that we find compelling, which move us, which call our names, and then there are social justice projects that flatten us. We tend to refuse the many projects with theories of change that rely upon the benevolence of the state or of the dominant in society. So that means that we refuse justice projects which require us to prove humanity or worth, justice projects which require us to front-load a lot of learning or consciousness raising, justice projects which require us to appeal to people who abuse us, justice projects which require us to gather an audience of white settlers who are presumed to have more agency than us, or justice projects that presume that compromise is the main avenue for achieving solidarity. We talk about social justice as words that work as a signal in the fields of education, but in other social science fields and in the law. In the interdisciplinary field of education, the term social justice works to set certain approaches and aims apart from positivist approaches. Thus, for those of us in education who reject positivist and developmental paradigms, social justice has been a way to signal to ourselves and to one another this epistemological and political difference. Social justice is a way to mark a distinction from the origins and habits of almost all disciplines which emerged in the 19th and 20th centuries and are rooted in colonialism and white supremacy. Social justice education is a way to refer to all research and practice within the domains of education which are a departure from behavioral or cognitive or developmental approaches. This is, of course, not to say that individuals who locate their work in these disciplines don't care about improving the lives of everyday people, but that social justice education has been a way for those of us outside those disciplines to still find a home in education and in schools of education, even though those places as home are frequently encroached upon. Social justice education is a self-conscious exception to the otherwise teleological imperatives of what has, up until now, typified the field of education. In this way, social justice education has served the role of the other box on surveys. I'm talking about how race or language might appear on a survey as a catch-all term for those who find themselves outside of the sanctioned intellectual traditions of education. Still, the need for a term that serves the function of an other box is still abundantly apparent because much of what gets researched and published within the field of education is actually research that pathologizes communities, youth, children, and families. So much of what gets circulated is still squawking about getting communities, youth, children, and families caught up with white and middle-class people, as Lee Patel critiques in her chapter in Toward What Justice. People who use social justice as a signal about what their work engages understand that inequities are produced, inequities are structured, and that things have got to change in order to achieve different educational outcomes. Social justice education is a choice away from pathology and linearity. Because it is such an important choice away, because it represents such a pertinent epistemological and methodological departure from other commonplace practices in the field, many groups of students and faculty and universities have attempted to institutionalize social justice education. However, institutionalizing social justice, and I work in a department of social justice education, so institutionalizing social justice education has its deep contradictions. These reasons are expounded on throughout the book, Toward What Justice, and openly addressed in chapters by Ronaldo Walcott and Sandy Grande. We do not say that all education programs should be called social justice programs. Rather, we say that social justice is the ghost in the machine of the educational apparatus. It is the only part that makes any of the parts of the field of education matter. With or without formally institutionalizing social justice education, it is not a countercultural movement within the broader field of education. Thus, social justice is not some boutique aspect of the field of education, some little meandering down a curious alley. This is not a conversation at the margins of the field. Social justice education, whether we continue to use those words to define it, is the crux of the future of our field. Social justice is not the other of the field of education, it is the field. There is no future in the field of education without the contributions of people who are doing their work under the rising sign of social justice. There is no legitimacy to the field of education if it cannot meaningfully attend to social contexts, to historical and contemporary structures of settler colonialism, white supremacy, and anti-Blackness. Social justice is not the catch-all, it is the all. In a forthcoming edited volume that Kay Wayne Yang and I co-edited with Linda Tuhiwai Smith, called Indigenous and Decolonizing Studies in Education, we used the space of the introduction to interview Dr. Tuhiwai Smith about her many contributions to discussions on Indigenous studies and education and research. She agreed, but only if she could also interview me. So one of the questions that she asked me was, why do you continue to locate your work in education? Part of how I ended up locating my work in education, as I've talked with you about this afternoon, has to do with the way that my story has unfolded, that I worked with mentors who located their work in education, that the community organizing that I learned from in the early years of my career were across environmental, education, and anti-carceral system movements. I was doing participatory educational design, participatory curriculum development, and participatory action research in my role as a community educator before I learned the words for what I was doing when I went to graduate school. So this isn't to say that I'm somehow advanced or unique, but that community learning spaces already do so much of what gets legitimated and valued as research in the academy. So part of how I found myself in the field of education has to do with the types of organizing that I saw as most urgent at the time that I was entering graduate school. So school policy, environmental racism, policing, and community-led social change. I do sometimes pause to consider why I have stayed in the field of education, rather than move to another interdisciplinary field. First, this is a field that, when it's at its best, embraces and anticipates change. Change, the likelihood of change, the certainty of change with uncertain outcomes are foundational to questions of education and learning. The whole field pivots on how change happens and how our efforts as humans can bring about the changes that we want to see. This is at the level of the individual, at the level of communities, and at the level of societies or polities. And this is not an ordered scaling. Change does not necessarily go in the order from individual to polity or from polity to individual. I like working in a field in which change is at the core of what we talk about. However, sometimes our field tries to discuss or deal with change by making things static, when they are definitely not static. Education in this way, when it tries to make itself too much like other fields, makes humans and human activities into predictable boxes which can be stacked to add up to certain things or to certainty. I disbelieve in those research practices, and I disbelieve in their centrality to our field. I also like working in a field that is concerned with relationality. This is why teacher education, teacher research, and teaching are so integral to education research more broadly. The relationality of teaching is so immediate, so urgent, that it doesn't allow itself to be overshadowed. It helps to remind that much of what we're looking at, what we are studying when we are doing educational research, is engaging in and simultaneously seeking to know more about relationships and relationality. I'll close with this idea. writing about the failures of a coalitional mobilization against an anti-Muslim charter in Quebec and addressing its own anti-Blackness. Delise Mugabo argues that we must refuse coalitions with dreams and projects which cannot imagine Black life. A Black feminist activist, Mugabo powerfully insists, I cannot work side by side with people who are not able to imagine what joy would look like for me in a new world. Let's hold these words, those whose futures are inconceivable, close, rolling them around inside with growing resolve. It is our work, the work of our field, the work of doing work with people rather than on people, to show the ways that seemingly inconceivable futures are not inconceivable, as much as it is our corollary work to demonstrate that white supremacy and fascism have no future on these lands. The arc is always bending. What futures are possible for those whose futures are inconceivable?
Oh, you need your glasses. Okay. Good evening. Let me make sure this is turned on. I'm going to try to be really quick so we can get to the conversation, because I'm sure that Dr. Tuck's talk elicited a lot of conversation. I will, if possible, if you can get the text and read it, it's so beautifully written. And Naila, your comment around Lisa Delpet, I kept thinking when I was reading it, I was like, this is one of those texts that you come back to a time again because the nuggets are there. So I want to start with first saying a couple of things I really want to point out that were really impactful in the work. When you started with Megan Bang's quote and around the layers of colonial feel, and that you're only in a community, when we walk into spaces, we're walking in at that moment. And those spaces are historical, and oftentimes they're layered. If you've ever, traveled overseas and you've been given a tour, and you're seeing a church, if you're in Rome, they show you the layers upon layers of society that have built up on top of places, and you're only seeing one layer until someone provides a view and a window for you. And I think that quote is so important that you can't see it unless you're in conversation and collaboration with individuals in those communities who then trust you enough to take the walk through the communities to point out to you the important points. And I think we are sitting in this moment where, I think the question is still a important question. Are we doing research on, or are we doing research with? But I would say, I think our structures in academia, I think we are all, the question is, we're always doing research on. The question is, can we also do research with? Because in my own experience, I just think our structures make it hard for us to truly always do research with. While we might be in conversation with and learning from, our structures still require when we speak. I'm up here speaking, not my team who's doing the work. I'm often having to do the translation from conversations and translating into my own words into someone else. So I think, given in today's age where we are with technology and with structures, we have to create new ways of allowing the real words, the raw words, the real voices of the individuals that we're in collaboration with to be heard and to be understood by the community, and not necessarily always as us as researchers doing that work, because they are, as you said in your words, they are experts too. And it's not necessarily for us to make that interpretation. And to speak on that one, I just moved from Chicago to Evanston. And I thought, oh, I understand Evanston. It's just on the other, the suburb of Chicago. And I can walk in and do the same type of work that I've always done. But instantaneously realized that because I am African American living in the 5th Ward of Evanston does not mean I understand the history and the realities of the individuals who live there. So even as an African American researcher, I have to make sure that I take the time and create the space that allows me to hear and understand the histories and the realities of the individuals in those spaces. And that points out to the importance of the intersectionality of race and class and gender. And however we might understand that in any particular space, that is intersected with the realities of the local histories of those particular locations. And so we always have to make room at the table for others. But we have to, in order to make that room, we probably have to ask ourselves, is the table in the right room? Right? Me making a room for a table at 12 o'clock in the afternoon for community members to come in our conversation is not really making room at that table. So how are we reframing, rethinking where conversations are taking place? Second, you raised a point about, and I want to, about the ambivalence that you feel as an academic, right? Or you 1 foot in or 1 foot out. And that really stuck with me because I think I've also felt that ambivalence of am I an academic or am I an activist in some ways? But I think that awareness, the complexity, the awareness of those two roles creates this, oftentimes I think for me has been a debilitating, oftentimes can be debilitating in keeping you silent in terms of writing what you understand, because you understand the complexity, and in writing, you're trying to get to something to be clear. And as you understand its complexity, oftentimes you never get to the point of feeling that you've understood it enough. But I would challenge us, particularly those of researchers of color, to push through that and to share wherever our complexity is at that moment. Because what we see is we're often not sharing our voice and our understanding as we're still constantly trying to get to a clearer, deeper understanding. Finally, I think you raised the question of mixed methods. And whether we're doing qualitative or quantitative. And I think it's so important at this moment that we have to do mixed methods and we have to understand ecosystems. And so for my own work here in Chicago, we've done a lot of work on trying to develop, create opportunities for kids to code. And for years, we focused on the classroom setting. And so oftentimes we spend so much time focusing on can we create culturally relevant content, which I think is so important, still want to do that. But it wasn't until we took a step outside to understand that so many of the issues we were dealing with had nothing to do with curriculum, had so much to do with the decisions that had been made a long time ago around transportation systems, about where programs are offered, what is offered where, that create an ecosystem of opportunities for some and a desert of opportunities for others. And so that you can often only see the forcing factors that are influencing or inhibiting individuals and students to come into your learning spaces. Until you can't see it until you take a step out and look at the patterns of the data. And so I think we, as educators and learners, have to begin to understand our mixed methods and understand our partnerships that are needed, I think, which speaks to your notion of, my computer just went off, speak to your notions of, it's a great term, let me find it, your notions of the collectives, right? And I'm reminded of the New London Group. One of the best articles I read is it was a collective. You know, I had to go back years later and say, well, who actually were the members of the New London Group? So how do we create these collectives that at its core demonstrates that no one person, no one perspective can address and solve any of these issues, and at the core we're always working together. And as a computer scientist, no one knows who writes the software. Do you know I mean, you might think Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg wrote that, but he really didn't. But most software programs you use, you have no idea who wrote it, because we know that no one person can do it. And so I challenge us as researchers in the education space and all the social sciences space to sort of think about how do we begin to work more in the collectives that aren't just researchers, but are participants, community members, and in ways that can privilege the work that they've done and give credit to the work that they've done. But at the same time, understand that there might be different ways of giving that respect, because just while a name on a paper might be meaningful to us, a name on a paper might not necessarily be meaningful to a mentor in some other spaces. And then finally, the concept of desire-based research. desire-based. I'm trying to think about can we have desired-based implementation research? Because I think how you talk about desired research as frameworks for understanding the complexity, contradictions, and self-determination of lived lives. If we can marry that with some of the research practice work we're doing, how can we then take that concept of desire and with our understanding of trying to have impact and come up with ways that are respectful and give power to the voices of the community to help us to come up with, not even solutions, but come up with practices that can help us create not just educational systems, but learning systems that have to span not just schools, but the community spaces in which we spend our time. So with that, I'll be quiet so that we can have the conversation. Is it all of us? Is it all of us or just? Oh, no, that's fine.
Testing. I'm going to be very brief because I want to make sure we have enough time for our Q&As, but Dr. Tuck, as I was listening to you, you really heightened the significance of community-engaged research and how we need to move forward with serious intentionality in ways that favors the communities. You painted a very, very powerful canvas, a critical canvas for us to think about tonight, but you also constructed a real scaffold with words that each word in and of itself could be a chapter. You talked about re-humiliation and reification and how research needs to move forward in a very powerful and responsible way. So thank you for that. And Nicole, thank you for your response to that. But with that, I'm just going to open up the floor for questions. And if you approach one of the mics because it's being video recorded, and please identify either Nicole or Dr. Tuck who wants to respond to the questions.
Is my mic live? Yeah.
Yes.
I think the first question is going to be awarded a Spencer Foundation grant.
I do have a lot of questions for this terrific talk and response, but there's no way I'm going first. Okay, here's the question.
I appreciate that move.
Thank you.
I really do. I appreciate that move. I think it's good to be conscious of who asks the first question. This is what Susan Apatow's work has shown in legal cases, that who gets the first framing informs so much of how it goes. And so, for whatever reasons that you're feeling like it's not appropriate to ask the first question, that might be you might be right.
I really do think I am. I'm going to take a bold move here and tell a joke about mansplaining. Where does a mansplainer
No, you might be right.
Where does a mansplainer get his water? Well, actually. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's it.
So maybe there's somebody else who wants to. Is it me? Is it my hair?
Maybe it's me.
Hi, I'm Helen. Thank you for your talk, and I really appreciated hearing about how your different experiences kind of informs the work and the orientation that you have. And I guess my questions are more around the practical, dimensions of how you engage with communities now that you have had these important life experiences that have connected you and made you more critically conscious and just also more skilled. And so I want to hear a little bit more about the experiences that you've had in terms of how you've engaged with collectives and worked to support the work of collectives. So it's kind of veering a little bit away from the theory part, so I'm not sure if we're at this point right now to be able to talk about it, but I'd love to hear more about that dimension of your work.
Well, the theory is only made possible through all of that collaboration. So it's not as though I figured out the theory and then started collaborating. There's years and years of working in participatory research collaborations that inform the social theorizing that I do, and then the social theorizing that I do is very directly connected to the kinds of collaborations that I engage in. Some of those collaborations are ones that I initiate. So the most recent one that we're wrapping up later this week is a collaboration with Black and Indigenous youth in Toronto, in which we're engaging in photo voice and other kinds of participatory image-based work in order to ask questions about what social movements like Black Lives Matter and Idle No More mean for young people and the ways that they are imagining what they'll do after high school, their kind of post-secondary decision-making. And so I had the wonderful opportunity to have lunch with graduate students earlier today, and one of the things that I was talking about is that I'm sorry that I cannot figure out.
Check, check.
I'm wearing noisy fabric. So one of the things that I was saying in that lunch, which is not necessarily, it's what I've done, but it's not what I would advise. It's just, sometimes that happens, right? Like what I do is not what I advise other people to do. But over the past 15 years, I've been participating in over a dozen projects. Some that are projects that I initiated, some with collectives that already existed and approached me. That's when work got super fun, when it wasn't just me coming up with an idea, but community organizations would come to me with an idea. And some of that is work that I publish about, and some of that work is just for that work, because we were creating data that were useful for the social movements or for those community organizing campaigns that people were working on. But so then how that work shows up in my work is as social theory. So there's a deep kind of reverberation, there's a deep interplay between the kinds of what might get called practical work and the theoretical work. What I can say is that working with young people or working with communities who are working on abolition or who are working on decolonization, these are not theories for them, these are practical. This is what life is about. Like, this is what is next. This is not something that's down the road, like maybe we'll move the needle a couple of spots in my lifetime. Like, this is what's happening next. And so the theory is immensely practical.
Is this? I just want to also thank you again for your work. Questions. And one of them is you talked about desire. I know that you gave some insight on it, but if you had a definition for that, what would you say it is?
I do have several definitions of it. So this is work that I talk about in an expanded way in an article, the article that I was talking about today, Suspending Damage, which is from 2009. And then I talk about it in a longer way in my first book, which is called Urban Youth and School Pushout. And then I talk about it in another way in a 2010 article called Breaking Up with Deleuze. And for me, what desire-based frameworks are, it's not like the opposite of damage. It's not like yesterday, your peanut butter is my banana. But it's instead attending to complexity. So I'm not going to look for the ways that harm has been done here, but I'm going to look for the ways in which people are navigating systems in one way in the morning, and then promising themselves something different when they go to bed at night, and then in the morning having to do that same thing again. And so trying to tell those stories in ways that are not about that person being duped by the system, which is often how people talk about people, but instead as knowing quite a lot about what is available to them or not available to them. And so really in social science research and empirical work, looking for stories of complexity instead of, and those stories of complexity are kind of like wrapped up in both hope and despair.
Okay, that's I like that. And the last question, you talked about when you were about to kind of give up on this, and you were encouraged to dare to write about the things that needed to be pushed on in research. Do you think that it helped that you had the right names and the right people alongside you as you did that? Because sometimes we are told to wait until you get tenured or you get this or that. So what do you think was something that was beneficial for you in that process?
I'm taking your question seriously because I have had phenomenal mentors who never told me to wait. And so I don't have the experience of having a mentor telling me to wait. I just know that other people have that. And so, but that wasn't accidental. Like, I chose those mentors too. Like, we mutually chose each other. I think that the idea, so I have a personal pet peeve about people who are super powerful who act disempowered. When I was an undergraduate student, I looked at professors as having so much power. And then I even, so in graduate school when people are saying, well, wait until do that work until after the dissertation. Well, and then wait to do that work until after tenure and promotion. Wait to do after that work until after your associate or after your full. You could defer, you could die before you do the work that you're supposed to do. And that is how the academy reproduces itself. And I think of the academy as quite dysfunctional for that very reason. And so I disbelieve in the idea that deferring our important work in order to get tenure at a place that it could shut down your department after you have tenure. It could close down its whole faculty of education after you get tenure. And so what does your tenure mean? Your tenure means that you're obligated to a university that's going to make decisions against your best wishes, against your well-being. So that is not to say that I don't believe in tenure, because I believe in tenure very much. But I don't think that we can act as though we have no power. The whole time that we are waiting to do our work, we're doing fake work, a false version of a performance of ourselves out to the world that is bringing people to us. Students come to work with you on that fake work, that work that's not your heart work. You get publications, you're talking at AERA about work that doesn't matter to you. You're going to spend all those years doing something that is only a a small part of what you came here to do. So I think that the important thing, especially for Indigenous faculty, for Black faculty, for faculty of color, for queer faculty of color, I think that we have to be doing that work so that other people can find us, so that we can make relationship with other people, because otherwise we're gonna drown. We have to be in relationship to each other, and so our work is one of the ways that people can come to know. Our work is the invitation to other people to come and be in relationship with us. And I don't believe in the idea of waiting 6 years into your career to do that.
Can I answer, have a similar question for that? I think my mic is a lot. So I guess an answer to that, I was never told not to do a particular, not to be an critical or an advocate, but I was told, I was a computer scientist, not to do any more development and to just, you know, study the work that I've done. And at that point, the decision for me was whether I was trying to be a researcher or whether I was really trying to understand and understand an area in a domain. At that point, it wasn't about being a researcher. It was about I really needed to understand. And to do that work, I needed to do the development and work. And so at that point, you just have to have trust in yourself, and to move where you need to move. And then also trust in having, but also making sure you have great mentors who help you understand that there's multiple pathways back. And so for me, it was some intentionality of finding myself at the University of Chicago, where it didn't have a school of ed, so you didn't have the same structures that were pushing you towards doing a traditional type of research, but it was a research institution that was still going to force me to do research. So I think there's, you just have to be honest with yourself about why. I have other colleagues who really, their purpose is to be a professor. And so in that sense, they will take that concept and say, well, I need to continue on the path that's going to get me there. So it really, I think we all come, and I think part of what you talked about, your journey into this work wasn't because you wanted to be a professor, it was really trying to understand the issues. And I just think it really depends on your path in and being true to your path and allowing it to follow. Because there's so many types of opportunities of ways in which you can still be active and impactful for your communities as a professor, as a researcher, as multiple different ways.
And while we wait for the next question, I wrestle with the same tension. And as an early professor, I ask myself, who am I here to serve? And I reconcile that it's easy to serve self. It's more difficult to serve others. And it's the othering that leads you down a particular type of path. So what risk are you willing to take with your own research? Being safe in and of itself may not have the benefits that you signed up for.
And it might make you sick. You might get sick waiting that long.
So, thank you for that wonderful talk and thought-provoking talk. I have several ideas spinning around. I'll try to put it into one concise kind of question. When you do take that leap to get your ideas out there in the academic world and in the published world, those ideas go down on paper. And I really appreciated how you mentioned, as you talked about citation, of the citations that you neglected in past research.
Because I hadn't read them.
Because you hadn't met them yet, exactly. Yeah. But I think one problem, you've listed many problems with academia. One problem with academia is the ego part of it, and the fact that when your work goes down on paper and becomes part of a written record, there's times we would later reflect back on our work and want to change that record because we've learned more or thought more. And you can do that with further publications, but I think that there's not enough mechanisms with which to self-correct in academia and to be humble about one's own work and the directions that, that you should have taken had you known better in the past. And so I'm just wondering if have you thought about that, and what kind of mechanisms could we put in place to be a more reflective, humble, and self-correcting academia?
This is also something that came up earlier today in the great lunch conversation with the graduate students here. And I think there is so much pressure to act as though we know everything And really, we have another choice available to us, which is to reveal ourselves to be learners and reveal ourselves to be learning all the time. And if any field can and should be doing it, it's our field in which we put into place some other practices to be able to, I am a big fan in writing of doing the direct address and saying, like, these are ideas that I am just beginning to work with, and I can't possibly. So part of it is to build into the initial discussions of ideas, the idea that you're still learning and growing, that I'm still learning and growing. And then in other writing, like in later writing, to be able to say, like, I wish I could say that differently now. I would say it differently now. I mean, this happens, I guess, because I teach in a place in which I don't usually teach very much of my work, but students are reading my work in other classes, and then they come to me wanting me to make those same arguments. And I was trying to think earlier today of an animal that I think I am cool with that sheds its skin, and it's very hard for me to think of one. I keep thinking of like cicadas or something that, but like, you know, animals that shed skins or exoskeletons or whatever, like, they do that because they grew out of them. They do that because their bodies split those skeletons and they had to shed them because they had grown. And I would like for us in our field to be able to think of our writings as the kind of shed skins of our thinking at that particular time. At the same time, recognizing the way that our writing is sometimes the only way that we are in conversation with other Indigenous scholars. Like Linda Tuhiwai Smith used to tell me that we write to each other in the footnotes. Indigenous scholars, Indigenous women are writing to one another in our footnotes. And I remember an editor who I love told me that I don't know if she knows that she told me this, but that I used too many footnotes at one point, and I was like, I am writing to Dr. Linda Tuhiwai Smith. Like, but now I write with Dr. Smith in our book series, you know, so we moved what was in the footnotes into a whole book series. And I have not been doing this that long. So I think part of the practice might be to build in the initial discussions of something, the ways that we anticipate growth, we anticipate change, and then in picking up threads later, talk about what we learned later, what we would have said a different way if we could. If any field can do it, it's our field.
You know, to piggyback on that again, as a computer scientist, you're not using the first version of Microsoft Word, right? We, in other areas, we understand that things are going to change and grow. And we've created systems to allow you to push those changes in your apps. Everything is updating now. So I think we as a field need to, as our things become more digital, explore ways to allow there to be iterations on ideas and drafts and versions of papers. We have that in other fields. We just need to understand and think about how we can embed that into our own now that we have digital platforms. We don't have to send you out a new journal. There has to be ways in which you can, we can layer our understandings into our writings.
Annotating our own work, perhaps. And just say, like, I wish I didn't listen to Clippy that time. Shouldn't have listened to Clippy.
We probably have time for one more question, and then we'll be able to fellowship afterwards. So one more here. Yes, please.
Well, I want to make sure I give space to other people. Does anybody else really, really have a question that they want to ask? If so, you can have it.
Hi. So I am asking for some. For some practical advice. So I work in the Chinese American community, and this is a community. It's not like Indigenous Black folks, where oftentimes we are actually perpetuating the harm against other communities. And it's like a very fragmented, I mean, like lots of like different class, like oppressing other classes in the community itself. And so I'm just wondering, like, when you do this sort of participatory research, or do you ever encounter obstacles from other segments in the community itself? And if so, how do you overcome that to really get like the voice that needs it the most, to amplify that voice? Yeah, even though like all those different parts are embedded in the community, so I mean they're always going to be there. And I don't know, like in my experience at least, oftentimes, it's like for example, like the most racist voices, it's like, well, they are also very traumatized as well. So I don't know how to deal with that sort of inter-community conflict when doing this research. I don't know if that's like a problem that you face.
So there are a number of different discussions in participatory work about doing participatory work with people who have lots of privilege. And I'm trying to think of somebody who I know who's writing about this right now, but 10 years ago or so, Brett Stout was writing about this, and Ruben Gastambide Fernandez has written about doing participatory or very collaborative work with elites. And so perhaps that conversation about those conversations might be places to turn. What I'm thinking, though, is that it makes sense for me to connect you with some of the students that I'm working with at UIC, who are working with mostly Chinese communities in and around Toronto, who are navigating some of these same things. One move that I make that I feel like is quite practical is to when I was talking about things that don't get shared outside of the community work, sometimes what is participatory research is very much a pedagogical project in which we're unearthing the long-held misunderstandings or long-held anti-Black sentiments or like long-held things, and those are not things to like bring back into the academy, because those ideas can do harm to the communities, even though that work needs to be done. And so that's part of like what I was talking about in not circulating work that re-humiliates, or not circulating work that reifies existing stereotypes, and not trusting the academy to know what to do with that. But that work still happens. It's just not happening in a way that shows up as an academic publication. And so that means that for other people who are starting to engage that work, there's not the written record there to figure out how other people are navigating it. And so the solution is to come into relationship with other people who are navigating it, to learn from how other people are thinking about this. The other move that is really important to me when I'm working with communities, and especially with young people, is to think of their roles as co-theorists, and how we think about the work that we do in collectives as co-theorizing. And so when you're co-theorizing, you can bring the fact of racism, or you can bring the fact of colonial attitudes to that group in order for them to theorize it. And that to me has been a very direct way of addressing maybe some of what you're talking about. To bring the kinds of speech acts or the kinds of sentiments that you're observing and that you are concerned about to that group to theorize about.
Great. Again, I want to thank the Spencer Foundation, our respondent, Dr. Nicole Pinkert, and our lecturer for this evening, Dr. Eve Tuck. And I want to thank each of you for coming out and participating in the Chicago Speaker Series. I believe there's some food and drinks on the other side of this wall. That's what I was told. So let's continue to fellowship and enjoy the rest of the evening. Thanks again.